Everyone, thank you so much for joining today, our World Cup 2026 halftime show. I want to welcome you alongside David Lowe, who's the current and new CMO at Cyabra. My name is Jimmy Lasky. I'm a strategic account director here at Onclusive. David, anything that you want to add in here? Tell us a little bit about Cyabra.
Well, thank you, Jimmy. I appreciate you having us on. I joined Cyabra this past year because I believe in their mission, and that doesn't come around too often. But the mission is to restore trust and authenticity online. It's something we need more than ever now, especially with the rise of AI. It's just made it cheaper, faster, right, and better to change conversations. And what we do, for those who don't know, is we help enterprises and governments detect manipulation, coordinated behavior, and inauthentic activity that erodes it. Most recently, actually, Gartner just announced emerging market quadrants and defined this sector as narrative intelligence. So it's no longer kind of a nice to have, it's a need to have. And we're really excited to be teaming up. I'm excited to team up with you, Jimmy, and Cyabra's excited to team up with Onclusive today. Hopefully this is the first of more to come.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those of you who don't know about Onclusive, we are a media monitoring and social listening company. So really what you're going to hear a lot from us today are both ends of the spectrum. How can you listen to conversations and then understand how much of that conversation is authentic? And so for our overview, we have an extremely interesting webinar for you. For the brands and agencies that are managing the global environment around an event like the World Cup, it becomes incredibly complex. For example, going into this tournament, personally, I assumed that the conversation was going to be heavily dominated by US ICE enforcement, logistics, and the Iran conflict.
Well, I got to tell you, first of all, cheers to you, because taking on something like this, you need a platform with that much breadth. 3 host countries, 48 teams. That's a massive challenge. And so what everybody's going to see today is a lot of what you guys provide. I agree with you. I thought those were a lot of the topics that might come up. But really the question that we ask at Cyabra is not just about the topics and trends, but how much of that narrative is authentic and coordinated. And that's really where we pair up, and we'll talk more about how that works together.
Right, exactly. And I think that's where in our early conversations about this, David, right, we were talking about what do we expect to see? But then what does the data tell us? And that's where having these kinds of platforms is so important, because the data can challenge what our perceptions are and what we live in our little bubbles, right? You know, the algorithms and everything, they're so tailored to what we want to see. Right? So understanding, well, what does the data tell us about the conversations actually happening out there is really important, because that's what can lead to strategic decisions.
Let's jump into it.
Yeah, let's go. All right, so before we go into the actual data on this, we want to just give you an overview of our methodology. Our data set spans from May 11th through July 3rd. We've monitored across all major social platforms and traditional media. We've covered 8 languages because the World Cup audience is genuinely global. An Mbappe mention in Paris reads differently than an Mbappe mention in Tokyo, and both of those matter. So using Onclusive Monitor, or for some of you, you may know us as Critical Mention, we ingested over 28 million pieces of content daily. And then through social, this is providing that listening layer in Onclusive Social, so we can listen to the conversations occurring there. We use advanced Boolean topic clusters to monitor over 95 topics, looking at reach and a lot of the KPIs that you're familiar with. We've extracted new concepts automatically through our AI sense. For example, catching the Die Die anthem as a rising narrative before it actually went mainstream. But as we know, AI has taken over disinformation to a whole new level. Social listening alone is just the first step. So once we identify what is being said through the data at a massive scale, we need to know if that conversation is actually authentic. And that's where we've partnered with Cyabra.
And what Cyabra does is we take that information, and Onclusive did a lot of that broad research, and we took a look at a few of the narratives to see who's behind the activity, right? Is it authentic or real? What is the behavior? right? Is it coordinated or not? And how is that narrative or content being manipulated? And as you know, what makes our collaboration a force multiplier is exactly that, Onclusive's breadth with our depth. So maybe for those who don't know, right, about our category or how we work, right, social listening and monitoring has been around for a while. I see social listening as monitoring the whole ocean, right? When are waves forming? How big are they? How fast are they moving? But then when you listen to that, you don't know, are you really listening to organic conversations? And when you layer our narrative intelligence on top of that, it's not the breath, it's going under the water. It's how deep, right, can you see? How much of the narrative is disinformation, if it's inauthentic activity, or if it's coordinated campaigns. So to make this seamless, right, our collaboration is more than just a name. So we're thrilled to announce our collaboration between our companies. And together that means your customers, right, that you have now can actually use your platform and take those really complicated Boolean searches and actually bring them into Cyabra. So you're not doubling costs or time, right? That work really becomes something that's very efficient to work together. And again, understand not only what the trends are, what they're saying, but how much of it is real or not.
Right. And it's that efficiency that you can take advantage of with this partnership. And I just want to point out that I really like your analogy of the ocean and the waves, right? Because if you look at the sheer scale of conversation just happening around the World Cup, I mean, we have over 52 million mentions that reach over 50 billion, that have an estimated reach of over 50 billion. So, I think the ocean is a really great analogy in this conversation because there's so much conversation going on out there around this that, it's how deep does this go? And we can see that, for social posts alone, we have almost 50 million social posts that have mentioned the World Cup in the last month or so here. And again, with that, how deep does that conversation go? Which is why we're tracking all 48 teams, 95 plus topics, and 9 different languages. So where is this attention actually living, right? You can see here that 90% of this conversation is happening on social. However, if you remember the last slide, 90% of the conversation or 90% of the reach was actually coming from traditional media. So it was really important to understand the complexities of both sides of that through a listening and monitoring tool, because you want to see where that conversation is happening, but then who has the most impact in that conversation. When we look at social, we can see that Twitter or X is dominating the conversation here with almost 2/3 total mentions on social itself. So if we look at it all up, we can see that 9 out of 10 World Cup conversations are happening on social media, but traditional media still plays an extremely important role in the overall reach. So social is where the narratives form and accelerate before the mainstream or traditional media picks them up.
And while you did a lot of the research in those social platforms, Cyabra works with those social platforms as well. So it really becomes a seamless experience. But you're right, understanding that spillover of when a conversation starts in social, yep, how big does it get? And then when it all of a sudden translates over to mainstream media, right, are important demarcations.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really important call out that you're looking at the same sources that we're looking at, right? Because we want to layer into one another what that partnership looks like. So that way it's an end-to-end comparison. So that way our clients can truly understand what the data tells them to make an informed strategic decision on what that strategy should look like going forward. So let's look at how the conversation has evolved. As we discussed at the start, the pre-tournament anxiety here evaporated once the whistle blew. There was actually a really interesting spike at very early on May 14th, when Madonna, Shakira, and BTS were announced that they will be the co-headliners at the halftime show for the finale, in July here. And then after that, conversation kind of just trickled off and stayed steady, but relatively low. Then after the opening ceremony match, and really even on June 17th with the Argentina-Algeria game, what we're seeing here is that a spike in conversation happened around players and teams. Specifically, some of those more famous players, Messi, arguably one of the best soccer, for those of you who are not an American citizen football fan. And that's really where the conversation started to spike out. And if we go then,
Jimmy,
yeah, go ahead, David.
I'm pretty surprised that the U.S. didn't pop here, right? I mean, we're hosting a lot of this,
right?
And it's pretty disappointing. But we do see traction in the U.S., but certainly it's not at the global scale of these other teams. But disappointing moment when we when we lost.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is that, and actually this is a good transition into the next slide here, because host cities, I think, is really where the U.S. has gained a lot of traction in that conversation. Of course, we're not the only host country. We are partnering with Canada and Mexico to have that. But, when looking at the data in totality, host cities are really being a big part of the conversation, with Seattle hosting, I think, the first U.S. game, right? And that was really big on and occurring on social. But overall, in the conversations that we're seeing around these topics, again, over 95 topics that we've tracked in its entirety, 75% of the conversation happens around teams and players. So if you look back to the slide that we just looked at, right, where some of those peaks were happening, the Argentina-Algeria game, Messi, even Erling Haaland, who we'll get to in a few here as well, really that conversation is happening around, and that excitement is happening around the teams and the players at this World Cup. So I think this is, again, going into seeing the teams and the players, who are the top teams and who are the top players in this. Brazil, of course, was a favorite. Unfortunately, they did not make it past the last round here, but it's led to some really interesting and impactful conversations that we are seeing online. Players, of course, you see Lionel Messi is the most mentioned player, unsurprisingly. And then we have some of those farewell generation players making it into here, with Ronaldo and Santos, both being part of the conversation occurring. Again, great players and great conversation, but that's where it can lead into also the players and the teams, kind of some of that misinformation, disinformation that's starting to come around.
It's exactly that, this kind of star power where sometimes bad actors exploit too, right? Big storylines draw big crowds, and crowds can be manipulated, right? It's very sophisticated now, what they're able to do. So one of the cases that you guys had noticed that we looked into was a claim of Norway's team brought its own food because they don't trust American standards. Well, what we found is about 17% were fake profiles. Now, whether that sounds like a lot to people or not, and maybe we should add the data after this presentation, but that 17,000, those 17,000 profiles were enough to turn 10,000 posts, right? Those 10,000 posts created 1 million engagements, and those million engagements actually had 37 million views. So you start to see how, the bad actors of a few, right, really start to accelerate conversations. But here's the key. This started as real criticism. So, in the past, the old bot farms, they might have just pushed out a narrative. It's much more sophisticated now. They'll find narratives, right, and then start to get into those conversations, start to respond in the threads. And so fake accounts didn't invent this. They just poured gas on it, right? So they took what was a sport, right, in terms of conversation, into anti-American messaging, right, which gets into geopolitics. And we don't sometimes know the exact actors behind it, but certainly you can see their motivations behind it. And what's important of knowing the difference between what's real or what's organic or what's manufactured is it could call for a very different response, whether it's from a government or a brand, right? Because that ratio could tell you whether to ignore something, monitor it, or actually respond to it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think too, especially in understanding how people perceive these conversations when they happen, right? You talked a lot about that engagement there and how much reach it totally got in the overall engagement of the story. And a lot of people, if that's the only time that they see this story, then that's the perception that they walk away with. They walk away with this anti-American distrust or this
Yeah.
conglomerate distrust. And that's what we see these bad actors leaning into and taking advantage of. I was fortunate in seeing a story that occurred a couple of weeks after I saw this storyline at first that really talked about how the reality of this situation is that, there are teams that will always bring their own food to different World Cups or different Olympics or whatever it might be. Back in 2014, this person had said that, Italy, for instance, had brought their own prosciutto to Brazil.
Right.
So it's leaning into these bad faith narratives that are really performing and leaving people with a bad taste in their mouth about whether it's a country or a brand or whatever it might be. So it's really important to understand what that authenticity is in it.
And part of what you'll see is, right, we not only point out what how many fake accounts there are or fake profiles there are, or how many posts there were or what the interactions are. It's also important to understand the content. So on this page here, we pointed out that there was a pretty mass amount of hostile language, right? And we define that in our platform as hostile language. So while people might have been talking about Norway bringing their own food in, all of a sudden these inauthentic actors started connecting it with poison, chemicals, right? With the US, toxicity, GMOs, additives. So they really changed the narrative from somebody bringing food to anti-American sentiment, right? And distrust.
Yeah, exactly. And that brings us into some of the other key storylines that we're seeing here, from geopolitics to the emotional and cultural narratives, on-pitch performance, controversy, and logistics and fan experience. These are just some of the areas that we're really seeing drive conversation, and it perfectly illustrates the hybrid media reality. And so going into then some of that logistic conversation here, another area that your team looked at was the coordinated resale scam network. So tell us a little bit about that, David.
So, you have to remember that this conversation wasn't just about scam, right? There were conversations, and legitimate ones, just about the cost of the tickets. And so,
Yep.
across all of that conversation about the tickets, about 18% of the profiles were fake. But when you start to zoom in into kind of that sub narrative of retail solicitation, right, where people were using words like tickets available, DM me, right, that jumped to 47% of the profiles were inauthentic. So you can see how an organic conversation just about ticket prices all of a sudden turned into a scam through these inauthentic actors. And on this one in particular, if you look at the bottom right corner here, what you're seeing are a coordinated activity. And coordinated activity used to just look like a whole bunch of red dots. Green means authentic, red means inauthentic. And what you're seeing is red dots interspersed with the green dots, which means it was highly coordinated. Those are different themes, and they interacted with those themes with organic conversation. So it's not just pushed out from these, inauthentic actors. And again, it's not just bots, right? There's sock puppets. These might be real people operating fake accounts. It could be troll farms, real people operating at scale. And but what we noticed is when you really get into it, we're able to detect. We have a few hundred parameters that determine if something's authentic or inauthentic. But they were using the same script every time. They had low followers, they had high posting cadence, and they had nearly identical phrasing, like instant transfer, serious buyers only, right? So it really turned a conversation into a scam. And ultimately, there were only 1,800 posts. But what's crazy is it ended up with 708 million views. So, the takeaway to me is that this isn't just reputational noise or a reputational issue, it's a live scam. And therefore, the response isn't just a statement, right? It becomes potentially a fan warning and getting those platforms to take those accounts down. And that's the action you can take once you understand what's authentic, what's real, what's not real.
Yeah, it's a really good point to make there, David, too. And, just understanding how those bad actors are operating in here is just so important for going into, the overall conversation and understanding, well, what are you going to do next?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So now, in understanding who's shaping the conversation, we could see that, SportsCenter and TVS Teka are leading the charge on Instagram here. well as on the traditional media sources. MSN and News and Yahoo are really leaning into their storytelling narratives in traditional media. Now, we talked a little bit earlier about those cities that are dominating that conversation. And, again, while the US is not dominating the overall conversation for the teams, we do still have a big significant impact in the cities that are dominating the conversation, with LA being the most mentioned. And then the New York and New Jersey stadium is also in the conversation. I imagine that New York and New Jersey, shout out to New Jersey, home state, will come in later and probably increase, as I believe that's where the World Cup finale is being hosted. So, it's also important to understand where these conversations are happening, because if you have a presence in one of these cities, you can take advantage of being in one of the host cities if you are not perhaps a sponsor, right? There are ways that you can lean into that conversation without having the same kind of budgets that, McDonald's or an EA or some of those other sponsors may have. And understanding to this point here, again, where are these conversations happening? What host cities are dominating the conversation the most? If you have a presence in Mexico City or in Boston or Atlanta or Toronto, you have an opportunity to take advantage of that conversation if you want to. And the data here supports that.
And Jimmy, we didn't go into this, but we've seen just with other clients who talk about host cities or areas, it's important for brands and also governments to know sometimes threats come out, right?
Yeah.
And really to help determine whether some of those threats or security issues, right, pop up, you really need to look at whether those are coming from authentic or inauthentic actors. And that's something that we do for a lot of our customers as well.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I know Dallas is listed on here, and there was some controversy in Dallas at one of the hotels where a police officer had supposedly aggravated a situation with one of the players. And so, yeah, understanding, to your point there, that's a security conversation, right? That goes into a risk that, you have to be listening to and then understand, okay, did this actually happen? Especially as AI videos get so much more advanced, right? Is this an AI trend or like a really convincing video, or did this actually happen and who's pushing that narrative? So jumping over now to just who's winning the sponsorship game. The official sponsors here, they still play a clear role. Hisense has a large share of voice, at almost 30%. And then domestically here, we see EA having a really big one. But I think more of the story here is the ambush brands. And this leans back into a little bit of those host cities, because the host cities can take advantage of, or going back into those locations, right? You can see SoFi Stadium in here, MetLife Stadium. Those are part of the conversation for the for those host cities in LA, in New York, New Jersey. And so having a presence again can help you, in the terms we're using here, ambush the conversation and take advantage of it. Now, of course, not everybody can go out and purchase a stadium. We don't all have that kind of budget, right? We'd like it, but we just don't have it. So again, it's just going into understanding what is happening in the conversation, where it's happening, and how can you take advantage of it.
By the way, this isn't what either of our platforms do, but I'd be really interested to understand how they did that, right? Because part of the FIFA rules were for all the names of the stadiums to come down. So, but I'm sure those brands and those cities found ways to push that information out in other means.
Yeah, exactly. Again, it's the same thing with like the Super Bowl, right? Their brands will talk about the big game, right? Because those are the ways that they can get around actually mentioning the World Cup itself. And so now, and then, we talked about ambush brands, but then also getting into player endorsements. So, earlier looking at it, we saw the data was telling us that almost 25% of the conversation was around teammates. And so when we look at it, we can see that player endorsements do really have a big part in that. So, Ronaldo and Nike are having a 13% share of voice. Yamal and McDonald's have a 10% share of voice here. And so leaning into those sponsorships can really also support a brand in getting visibility for this. So now breaking through the data sets, we can see a couple of trends here. And, David, of course, this data set ends before the Trump FIFA Balogun conversation. So, I want to give you a chance to talk a little bit about that, because we did look at that, right? And so we can actually even see here that, of course, it reached an incredibly high spike from Sunday on in just understanding what that conversation and it looks like and the impact of it.
Yeah, and I think we might have mentioned it up front, but when this obviously came out, and obviously it was mass media, so we knew about it. But of course, Onclusive caught this very early on and asked us just to take a quick look. And our data showed that actually almost all of it, I think it was over 95% of it, was authentic conversation. And as I mentioned, sometimes it's as important to know what's authentic, right? To know if you're a brand, if it really is all authentic and it's either negative sentiment or positive sentiment, you'd react a certain way, right?
Yeah.
You'd be able to be armed and know, versus if something is inauthentic and the majority of it's inauthentic and you respond to it, you're responding to nobody. You might be inflaming the story. In this case, it was all real, right? And while this one was about Trump, if it's about a brand or if it's about a government, they need to start having a handle on how much of that is real or not, in terms of how they then create a playbook to respond.
Yep. And then also just pointing out, the Norway-Brazil game, that was such an unexpected game. Again, Brazil was going in as a favorite, especially in that. And then Norway came in and had a major upset for Brazil, which, there was another conversation going around about scripted narratives. Oh, I guess maybe that slide is not there. Oh, did I maybe skip a little too far?
Maybe you jumped over it.
Yeah, I jumped over it. Let's go back. There we go. That's what I wanted. Sorry about that, folks.
All right.
Whereas that was very unscripted, right? But there are other conversations around other matches that were going around a scripted result.
So this one's really interesting, right? And we talked about before where there's drama, where there's high profile, it just opens up opportunity for conspiracies to take root. And this one, I don't know if people heard about, but Australia, Algeria and Austria drew 3-3, and the equalizer came in the 96th minute, right? And it started out actually as a single real post. And there was this conspiracy emerging around how FIFA and the US rigged it to the draw to eliminate Iran. And this echoed apparently some real 1982 precedent. It was known as the, apologize for if I pronounce this wrong, the disgrace of Dijon, where West Germany and Australia resulted also in actually, I believe West Germany needed 1 or 2 points, and they would both go into the next round and eliminated Algeria, right? But in this particular case, that one post ended up driving or getting connected with 22% of fake profiles. And but in this case, it's a bit different. On the others, I told you those fake profiles got involved, they amplified. In this case, it only generated about 0.2% of the engagement, right? And it traced back to that single account, but 40% of all that activity was clustered around amplifying that one post. So this is a case where you do need to know that high visibility doesn't always mean real traction, right? And that informs a brand how they should respond. Should we just monitor it? Should we ignore it? Should we take action before it? Because before reacting to something, you need to understand, did it take off with real people or not? Did it cross over to real media or not? Or was it just some bad actor that posted that didn't get a whole lot of interaction, right? And if that's the case, you might want to just ignore it, because as soon as you do acknowledge it, you've now just opened it up to a tremendous amount of organic or real people, and you can inflame the story itself.
Yeah, exactly. And so now, what are we watching in the quarterfinals? As we head into quarterfinals, communicators need to monitor key teams, players, narratives, like the Golden Boot race and the officiating credibility crisis. So again, looking at the actual data behind these topics, we see these narratives are escalating fast. So definitely pay attention to them as we head into the second half of this and of the World Cup, and especially as we head into the final game.
France Monaco today, Jimmy. Do you have a favorite?
I mean, I just listen. It's got to be France. Like, you know, it's just France actually plays a little dear to my heart. I've been there a couple times, so I definitely am rooting for them.
All right.
What about you?
You know, I do love the French team, but I also love an underdog story.
Yeah, it's true.
So I kind of like the idea of Morocco being an underdog story, but we'll see how that plays out.
Totally. So coming out of this, everybody, you can download this report. I know that we will be sending it out shortly after we end this conversation, but we do want to give you all the opportunity to ask David and I questions. So, you know, are there any questions on anything that you've seen today?
And I hope there's some questions because, again, this idea of narrative intelligence was just announced by Gartner about a week ago.
Yeah.
So what we do, what Cyabra has been doing for 8 years, has kind of just been legitimized. And the World Economic Forum actually identified this as the #1 issue in the coming years in terms of disinformation and misinformation for brands.
Right.
And so I think the industry has finally caught up to what Cyabra has been building over a number of years. If people aren't aware of the capabilities, I mean, they can feel free to ask now as well.
Yeah.
You seeing anything coming up, Jimmy?
I do not. Where is, let me go to the chat though. Yeah, I have no questions in here. Does anyone have any questions, even on the social listening side, or, you know, especially about the partnership that we're really excited to announce?
So we either just killed it and answered every question.
They've learned everything they need to know, you know,
or there wasn't enough insight. And, you know, we didn't want to make this boring and just do numbers the whole time, because that's certainly the worlds that we live in, really looking into the data and having our analysts uncover what's true, what's not true, where are the big trends. But what we hope you take away is the understanding also what these platforms are capable of doing, you know, from the social listening and monitoring side, and really being able to, at a really remarkable breadth, take in and understand what conversations are happening, and now layering on top of that, understanding how much of that is real. I mean, that's the real takeaway. It just happened to be an amazing moment of looking at the World Cup, because that's as big as you get, right, in terms of managing information and managing conversations. So kudos to you all.
Yeah. Thank you very much, everybody. We really appreciate your time today. Again, excited about this partnership. David, it's been a pleasure to work with you, and I'm excited to see what comes, not just from the World Cup, but from, you know, from us.
A lot more to come.
A lot more to come. Thanks, everyone.
Have a great day.